This is Kim Meyer, host of Choose to Rise. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
This is Madeline, host of Crowned and Dangerous here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Once you are done with this episode, I hope you'll come back to check out my show, Crowned and Dangerous, where Jessica and I talk about our time in the pageant world. A new show comes out bi-weekly on Thursdays. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you never miss an episode of Crowned and Dangerous. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Hey everyone, welcome to Duties and Headcanons, where we're nerdy, and you probably are too. I'm Lindsay, and I'm here today with Elizabeth, and we're here to talk nerdy to you about fan fiction. Now, Elizabeth is always telling us how she's a writer, and I thought it would be kind of fun to find out a little bit more about a certain kind of writing that I have a really hard time understanding, because I've never been someone who could do that. So I really like to write. No, I don't. I don't like to write essays, but it's really the only thing I've ever written, because I don't consider myself a writer or a creative type at all. But I thought it would be fun to talk about fan fiction. Now, there are all kinds of different sorts of fan fiction, and I always have a really hard time understanding when people draw pictures of characters together that don't belong together, or that you never see together, such as cross fandoms, cross anything. And fan fiction where people make up characters or create other storylines for characters that you don't necessarily see in the main storyline, things that they make up and things that they write together. Now, what really interests me about it is that I would think it would make more sense to create your own world and create your own characters and create your own things, because when you do that, you don't have the ability to make accidents or create things that aren't true. And I would have a hard time knowing everything there is to know about my fandom or the realm or the whatever that I'm writing about, because there's the only person who could possibly know all of that would be someone who's writing it. So, such as like Harry Potter with J.K. Rowling, or how she's the main source, she's the only source for a lot of that stuff. Once it's confirmed by her, then you know it's true. But other than that, with all the other fandoms we have, I would find that difficult. But there are people who don't feel that way, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I wanted to make sure that we're defining fan fiction. Mm-hmm. Just so that, we all understand what it is we're actually talking about. So Merriam-Webster does have a definition of their own, but I kind of prefer the definition on the Fanlore Wiki, which the Fanlore Wiki is basically a Wikipedia of all kinds of things fan-related, fandom, fan fiction, terms, things like that. And their definition is a little bit more involved and not as, short and succinct. Merriam-Webster's kind of thinks of fan fiction as today, but the Fanlore Wiki uses the definition that fan fiction is a work of fiction written by fans for other fans, taking a source text or a famous person as a point of departure. Fan fiction is most commonly produced within the context of a fanish community and can be shared online, such as in archives, or in print, such as in zines. Fanfiction is also written by fans in isolation and perhaps shared with a few friends or no one at all. And I have to admit, when I first started writing fanfiction, that I did write mostly in isolation. I didn't really share my writing with other people, and I'm very, very happy for that, because most of what my early work is absolute crap. So it's not floating out there, and I am so thankful for that.
Okay. So real quick though, fan fiction being written for oneself. Why? Why would you put all that effort into writing something that only you'd be able to enjoy?
Because it's more of an exercise of what you want to see and what you want to read. For me, myself, when I write fan fiction, I write things that I want to read, because I I mean, obviously, I am inspired in some way for a different storyline or a plot or something like that. But ultimately, quite a few of my stories have evolved or come about because I wanted to read a particular thing, but I wasn't able to find that thing. And so therefore I wrote it. And obviously if I didn't share it, it would just be something that I, kept to myself. But I don't have any problems sharing it with the masses. And so I posted it, and people on average seem to enjoy it, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, it's more of just, a personal thing that, oh, well, I want to read this. And not all authors feel the need to just share everything,
Okay. Okay. Now, is fan fiction also then when you have characters that are like in games I used to play, like EverQuest, where you would make stories about your dark elf venturing out and doing things?
Oh yeah, I mean, one of the many fandoms that I write in, a couple of them are video games. I've written some stories in Skyrim, and I've written some stories in Fallout 4. And I've basically like taken some of the characters that you see in the game, and I've written some things with them. And I've also written some things with characters that I've created, either as like the main player character or as just people out in the world. And so, I mean, yeah, that's definitely, a big thing in like the gaming fan fiction community is, taking these games that we play and kind of adding in all that backstory that you kind of mentally give your character, but that, you don't always necessarily express in the game.
Okay. But then you don't publish it or look to give it to the masses?
Oh, a lot of times, like authors who want to share their work, they will publish it on certain sites. Fanfiction.net is probably one of the more well known, just because it's been around for so long.
Sounds pretty easy to remember too.
Yeah, and I used to post there as well. However, I don't really like the site that much. I personally prefer Archive of Our Own. It's a little bit more well tended. I really like the tagging system because you can tag different things for your story. And then when, like, say you're looking for something really specific, then you can search by those tags and the fandoms and, even the pairings or, something like that. It's a lot easier to find more specific things when you're looking for it. Whereas in fanfiction.net, it's like, well, you might find it, you might not. You got to kind of just scroll and hope and pray that you find it.
You're kind of on your own with that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, there's other sites, that you can post on as well. I know back in the day, kind of before fanfiction.net became a thing, and really, honestly, before online publishing became a thing, they used to publish fan fiction in various zines, which, the definition and the fanlore wiki kind of mentioned. That was how, people gave their stories out, was they published them in fanzines and they handed them out at conventions or they mailed them to each other, what have you. That's how initially things were circulated. That's how it actually initially kind of started in the Star Trek fandom, and it just kind of evolved from there.
Okay.
And then when people started going online, they kind of started using the Yahoo email groups, and they used the LiveJournal was also very popular. And they also made archive sites, just based on various either fandoms, or sometimes they would base them around characters. My first actual experience with fan fiction was I was just researching things for Qui-Gon Jinn because I had just seen The Phantom Menace, and I really, really liked Qui-Gon Jinn, and I was, just basically reading everything I could about him. And I happened upon this website called QuiGonline.org, which is no longer functioning, unfortunately. But they had a fan fiction section. And I was like, oh, what's this? And I clicked on it, and there were all these stories involving Qui-Gon in some way. And I mean, you could find archive sites like that anywhere. GeoCities was pretty popular for people to just, quickly throw up a site of their own, and then they could either post their own, or, people could submit their own fan fiction that they would then post. And, it kind of traveled by word of mouth. And then, of course, fanfiction.net came along, and then Quote TV came along. Now there's Archive of Our Own, and there's Wattpad, and there's all kinds of different sites now that you can post your stories to. Basically, I mean, there are a lot of different avenues, and sharing stories these days are a lot easier than it was even like 10, 20 years ago.
Now you said fan fiction started with Star Trek.
Well, that's one of the major jumping off points, I guess you could say, for fan fiction. But fan fiction is actually a lot older than even Star Trek.
Okay.
Because, I mean, and this, again, this is depending on how you define what counts as fan fiction and how it's disseminated. Because, I mean, obviously Star Trek, as the Star Trek fandom was one of the originators with, I guess what you could say, like modern fan fiction. Right. But it's much, much deeper. Like, if you look at it, classics like the Aeneid, that's fan fiction. I mean, when you really think about it, it was a fan-written sequel to the Iliad. That's fan fiction. Right. A lot of Western literature is like that, actually, because Homer wrote, basically fan fiction about history, which we still have going these days in musicals like Hamilton and Elizabeth Doss musical. Those are fan fictions, more or less. And Virgil, he wrote fiction based on Homer, and Dante wrote fiction based on Virgil himself. And Dante even inserts himself into the stories. Right. Into the Inferno and the Divine Comedy.
I had never even thought of it that way.
Yeah, so I mean that's what we call a self-insert fic. And John Milton, he wrote Paradise Lost. Well, that's a fan fiction. That's based on the Book of Genesis. Huh. So yeah, I mean there's a lot of different authors throughout time that has basically more or less written fan fiction, but because it was written so long ago and it's become what we consider classics, that we don't really think about it in context of what it is. Right. There was a really interesting post on Tumblr that somebody had asked a literature professor what they thought about fan fiction. And I thought it was really interesting that part of their response was, this is what they said. Here's what fanfic authors and fans need to remember when anybody gives them crap. The idea that originality is somehow a good thing and innately preferable thing is a completely modern notion. Because, I mean, and what they say is up until about 300 years ago, a good writer, by and large, was someone who could take a tried and true story and make it even more awesome. And if you want to sound fancy, the technical term is imitatio. Because people back then were like, well, why would I want to read something about some dude I have no clue about? Like, there's this new Sir Gawain story that just got released. Why don't we read that? So, when it comes to mass-produced literature, back then, you had these stories that people basically just branched off of, whether it was King Arthur and his knights, the Knights of the Round Table, whether it was the Canterbury Tales. Shakespeare wrote fiction about real people, which is something that we in the community we call real people fic or real person fiction. Mm-hmm. So I mean that's a thing. And then of course since then a bunch of people have come through and more or less written fiction based off of Shakespeare and his works. Pride and Prejudice, or really Jane Austen's works. Her nieces wrote a bunch of stuff in her various worlds. Sherlock Holmes was also really popular to write about in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was the sharing of literature that really determined how popular something became. So, obviously throughout time, when it comes to literature, there are a couple of things you have to keep in mind, and that is who is able to do the writing. So, I mean, obviously, if you're a writer, you have to be able to read and write. I mean, that's obviously, very important to writing. So you have to be literate. You have to have somebody teach you to read and write. Mm-hmm. You have to be pretty well read. So you have to be able to afford books or be friends with somebody who has a bunch of books that they will lend you. You have to have the downtime, the leisure time to be able to write these things, because I mean, writing takes time. You can't just, bang out something really quick and then expect it to be good, so you have to have the time for that. And then, back then, before the invention of the internet, you had to be able to have it published and circulated. And so that also presented the issue of who was also writing, because, back then, publishing was a lot more complicated and complex than it is today, where, you could either publish it online or you could self-publish on Amazon. It was a lot more expensive endeavor. So, people, if they wanted to get published, one of the sure things was, oh, we'll take a story that everybody knows and let's write something a little bit different and let's offer something a little bit different. And that was considered good. It's really only recently that, consumers are like, oh, well, we want something original. We want something different. We don't want the same old,
Well, and it's interesting too when you think about like movies. Where they've been making so many movies that are something that we've already seen. Where they're remaking Sherlock Holmes, or they're doing another Spider-Man, or another something they've already made. And there's a realm of people who are okay with let's do it again and see if they can make it better, especially with all the technology we have now. But then there's, well, why aren't they just writing new stuff? And it's always been interesting to me the difference between how creative a person has to be in order to create a new thing, and how creative a person has to be in order to take something that someone has already created and make something else within it. And I had never really thought about it that way until talking just now, because I feel like they're both equally difficult. There's so much you could leave out if you're making your own thing, but there's so much that you have to take into account if you're working with someone else's realm, whatever.
I'm always a big proponent of Hollywood trying to be more original and, being more creative. But here's the thing, I don't necessarily mind doing things over, but it's the quality.
Right.
I think when they do a bunch of remakes, they tend to just, say, oh, well, people will buy it because it's this, so we don't have to put that much effort into it. And that's really what I take issue with Hollywood, is that they're being lazy,
Yeah.
But really, yeah, this, when you write fan fiction, there are a bunch of things that you have to take into consideration and that you have to research.
Mm-hmm.
Now, depending on the different type of story that you want to tell, different people will write different things. I write a variety. Some people will just write canon compliant fiction, which is, fiction that exists within canon, that, doesn't contradict canon in any way. And that, it could basically exist behind the scene, or it could explain certain things that, the canon material for whatever reason doesn't go into.
Right.
A lot of what I write is canon divergent, which is I take the story and the universe and I diverge from it at some point. It could be minor, like, oh, a character who is dead isn't dead anymore. Okay. Or you could take a whole storyline out and basically rewrite, what could happen instead.
Okay.
Say if, somebody made a different choice.
Okay.
And then there are what is called alternate universe, which is where you take familiar characters and you put them in a completely different setting. And this is perhaps one of the more challenging ones if it's done well, because, obviously there comes the point where you ask, well, why don't you just write this as original? Because the original characters that you're writing with are so different. Mm-hmm. And that's the challenge, is to write these same characters in a completely different setting, a completely different world, and still make them true to the characters that they are in their original world.
Right, but you have to know the characters well enough then to be able to translate them to...
Exactly. And then there's what we call fix-it fics, which are basically obviously they fix whatever the author thinks is broken in canon. It can be small, it can be large,
Sure.
And this obviously, these types of categories, this isn't really exhaustive, because there's all kinds of different types of fics. But I found that most fan fictions kind of fit under one of these categories. And, especially if you're doing something that's canon compliant or that's a fix-it, it gets really, really complicated, because you have to get into the nitty-gritty of the world itself. For instance, I'm planning a massive massive Lord of the Rings fix it, where I basically fix all the problems that I think are present in the story, even though I love the story itself. Like, I want to fix things.
Right.
So, I mean, I took a month this summer for my July Camp Nano, and I read all 3 books of the original trilogy, and I made copious notations as to like the timeline and what's happening when and what happens in what order and where these characters are on what day. And I even put in like some descriptions from the book so that I could like refer back to it if I, felt the need to.
Sure.
And even on top of that, like I had to do a bunch of research regarding how I thought that they might handle certain things, because I mean, this is supposed to be a prehistory, so they don't have like modern conveniences like toilets,
right,
or running water.
Sure.
So I had to do a bunch of research. Okay, well, how did people take baths back then? How did they handle hygiene or cleanliness? How did they use the bathroom? How did these things work? Like and how did they even dress, and what constituted, clothes back then? Like, there's so many different things that you have to take into account and research. I mean, it is almost like a bit of a part-time job.
Well, wait, and I feel like a lot of those things, though, aren't necessarily written. Like, Tolkien didn't write those kinds of mundane details into the story, did he?
No, not necessarily. He did touch a little bit on herbalism, which is one thing that I really researched a lot more about.
Okay.
Which is basically like using herbs and healing.
Sure.
But it's one of those things where it's, in order to kind of get into the nitty gritty into a fix-it, sometimes you need to understand how the world works.
Right.
And even if you don't necessarily use a piece of knowledge in that world, that knowledge is still in your head. So, like, say, there's actually a chart that I have saved where it kind of gives you a reasonable traveling time for, like, if you're traveling on foot or if you're traveling by horse or what have you. And so that kind of helps me keep in mind, okay, so, if a character starts out at this point, it will take them about this long to get to this place because it's, this many miles apart, and they travel this many miles a day. So, it kind of gives me a timeline. Whereas if you're not really thinking about that, you could write them as one day they're in Rivendell and the next day they're in Minas Tirith. And it's like, no, there's no way humanly possible that could happen,
right. Right, because you have already done the research, so it's going to take much longer.
Oh yeah. So it's kind of one of those things where you keep this information in the back of your head, and even if you don't necessarily put it in the story, it kind of gives you, the writer, a sense of how this world works and how it functions and what you might need to write in order to accommodate it, in other words.
I wanted to talk real briefly because I know that there have been published I always kind of assumed it was fan fiction, like with Star Wars. And that's kind of one of the big things now that we've got so many more movies that are coming out. We've been told that all of those books that were written, and there was a bunch of them, I can't even remember, but those were originally fan fiction, weren't they?
Oh, and here's the interesting thing about the Star Wars expanded universe. Originally, no, it wasn't fan fiction. These authors all had to, now I don't know the whole details of their contracts, but they had to operate and basically get permission from Lucasfilm in order to write their stories and in order to advance this. So, I mean, this was basically more or less canon, or it was considered to be.
But now it's not, right?
Yeah. Now, because I remember there was this huge thing when Luke finally had a romantic interest, the authors had to really fight and barter with Lucasfilm in order to get him that romantic interest. And, the way that they went about it and who they had in that position, it was a lot of effort. And of course, now with the sale of Lucasfilm to Disney, they basically took this Star Wars expanded universe and have made it, not canon anymore. So, looking at it back, looking at it now, then yeah, it basically is fan fiction, but it started out as more or less canon material. So it's kind of in a unique position that, it started out this and now it's not. And now, I mean, even parts of it is coming back into canon, like with Thrawn, because they put him back into Rebels, and they gave a new, I guess, contract or something to Timothy Zahn, and he wrote a brand new book for Thrawn, which I highly recommend because it was absolutely amazing.
Okay.
but yeah, so it's the Star Wars expanded universe is kind of in an interesting position with that.
And that's pretty unique, right? I mean, you don't really see a whole lot of that happening. Those zombie movies that you talked briefly about, like the classics and Jane Austen and some of those older ones. Haven't I also seen like Pride and Prejudice and zombies and death or something?
Yeah, and that's really fan fiction, more or less.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how they obtained the rights or how that all worked out, but I assume more than likely because it's an older story, there's something going on with their copyrights that they were able
there's like
to
a statute of limitations or something like you.
Yeah, so they're probably that's probably much easier to obtain than something that say just came out, like say the MCU. That would be a lot more difficult, if not impossible, to obtain.
And then you had also said something about how the original definition that you had seen at Merriam-Webster was more compliant with today's idea of fan fiction. How does it differ?
It's not as specific because it doesn't take into account, it really more or less mentions just things online. So it doesn't take into account that fan fiction predates the internet.
No, I totally agree then. Yeah, because it does sound like it can definitely be both and all-encompassing at the same time.
Yeah, so that's why I prefer the fan lore one, because it's a little bit more detailed in accounting for more or less everything that has come about.
And then how do you you said you go online and you can go to archives and different places to publish what you have, and that's not something that necessarily happened to begin with. Most of the time people were writing these for themselves, but I always kind of assumed writers would want to be published. They would want other people to read their writing. So at this point, like what do you plan to do personally with when you're finished writing what you are on Tolkien's universe?
I mean, I personally publish the vast majority of my stories just because I like to share, and because I figure if I saw a need or a want for a certain type of story and I didn't see it and I wrote it, that there might be other people out there who would want it. Now there are a couple of stories of my own that I'm keeping close to the chest that I may or may not publish. Sure. Just because, the material involved either I think would be slightly controversial and I don't want to deal with that, or just because it's more or less like a pet project of mine and I don't really care to share it. It's something that came to me more organically and I just don't feel the need to.
Well, I think that's what's so interesting to me too, is that I've never been a writer who would write unless I was being forced to write. You know what I mean? Even journaling, I find really difficult to do. It's really very regimented, very disciplined, and I've just not ever been someone who can sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write this. I think maybe at some point I was writing poetry, and that was just because it was for me. So I get it, but I also at the same time think it's very interesting to look at it now that all of these other things that I've probably already read or been accustomed to have also really been fan fiction at their very core.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole thing with fan fiction and the way it's been kind of developing within the last, say 30 or so on years with the advent of online, it's really interesting how, fan fiction was sort of just kept on the down low, especially back in, I believe it was the 90s when Anne Rice was coming around, and she was very, very anti-fan fiction, and she would actually send out cease and desist letters for different fan fiction authors, even though they weren't making any money off of it. They, she still basically basically was shutting it down. And there are a couple of authors that don't like fan fiction, and so whether people write them or not, they're very careful about it. But then there are other authors out there who do like fan fiction. Neil Gaiman is actually one of the authors who really like fan fiction and who actually has written fan fiction himself.
Oh,
cool. Yeah. He really likes it. He enjoys it. He endorses it. And to me, that's that's really awesome to see that, somebody who is an actual published author, thinks that, oh yeah, this is just as valid as, writing something original.
Right. Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you so much for tuning in with us today for our discussion of fan fiction. Do any of y'all write fan fiction? And if so, what do you think about it? You can find Beauties and Headcanons on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. Make sure you give us a like there. And if you can, share us with some of your friends. And I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Lindsay. And thanks for getting nerdy with us today on Beauties and Headcanons.